whether they be medical or residents or what have you. What primarily determines the way you teach? Is it intuition, the way you were taught, what you see your peers doing, educational theory and research, or none of the above? So let's do a hand poll. I realize that social desirability bias is real here, but who says intuition? I'm going to go with intuition. Anyone teach by intuition? No. How about the way you were taught? A lot of us, yeah, I think a lot of us, the way we teach is the way we were brought up in the educational system. How about what you see your peers doing? I say a couple, 2 or 3. And then last but not least, educational theory and research. Okay, so this is the one that, we hope everyone raises their hand, but, obviously isn't always the case, and then none of the above. So I'm gonna submit to you today a statement that might be a little bit controversial, maybe not, but I would say that the link between the psychology of learning, so what we know about learning from ed psych and cognitive psychology, the link between that and teaching is not all that direct. It's not a direct link. And this idea was articulated more than 120 years ago by the father of American psychology, William James. He did these talks with school teachers where he tried to apply what he knew from research in psychology to the classroom. These were called talks with teachers. And he made this somewhat famous quote. He said, "You make a very great mistake if you think that psychology, being the science of the mind's laws, is something from which you can deduce definite programs and schemes and methods of instruction for immediate classroom use. Psychology is a science and teaching is an art, and sciences never generate arts directly from themselves." And this is a key part of this. An intermediary inventive mind must make the application by using its originality. So, stated more simply, teaching methods must agree with psychology and the psychology of learning, but they can't immediately be deduced therefrom. Instead, we need the inventive minds of a teacher, and that's you all, to sort of make that translation. So teachers become like the engineers, translating the science into practice. All right, so with that backdrop, this is what I plan to cover. I'm going to present some principles about human psychology and learning, but I'm not going to tell you how to teach. Instead, I'm going to count on you as the inventive teachers to sort of make that translation. So I'm going to talk about 5 principles about human cognition, goals, emotions, learning styles, and student evaluations of teaching. Again, I'm not going to tell you how to teach. I think that's an impossible task, especially if we consider William James's quote and just the sheer variety and different contexts within which you all teach. However, I will, throughout the talk, sprinkle in sort of how I think you might apply these principles to education sort of more broadly. Okay, so here's my first principle. Again, I have 5 principles today in this talk, and I have 6 more this afternoon. Principle 1, cognitive strategies can make learning more efficient and effective. Okay, not a surprise, pretty obvious. My point here is that we've learned a lot over the last 70 years about the best ways, the most effective and efficient ways to get knowledge and skills organized and retained into long-term memory, and importantly, retrievable again when we need it at a later time. The question is, what are these strategies that we know work? Here's 6 of them. This comes from a group called the Learning Scientists. It's a group of cognitive psychologists who sort of collated the best evidence around what works. And their 6 strategies are elaboration, retrieval practice, spaced practice, dual coding, interleaving, and concrete examples. Again, this work mostly comes from the work in cognitive psychology, and they can broadly be applied across contexts. Now, I'm not going to talk about all 6 strategies. We could do a complete talk on just the strategies. Instead, I'm going to say a little bit more about retrieval practice, and I'll mention dual coding later in the talk. And by the way, I just wanted to say that this group is fantastic. They have a website. You can get there if you use that QR code on the lower left, and I'll share these slides when I'm done. They also have a textbook that's a visual guide to all these different strategies. I've used this textbook in a course that I teach on learning theories. So great group. It's sort of disembodied from the context of medical education. It's sort of education more broadly, but I think a lot of it can be applied to our work. All right, so before I talk about retrieval practice, let me say something about memory in general. I think most of us know this. Memory is a lot different than something like a video recording, right? Every time you watch a video, it's the same. Memory is different. Memory is very dynamic. Every time it's accessed, it's constructed and reconstructed. So every time you bring it to mind, it can be slightly changed. And knowing that has really important implications for learning. So let's think about retrieval practice. This is the idea that bringing information that you've learned to mind strengthens the neural connections and makes that information more memorable. So it's the very act of retrieval that strengthens the memory, making it more retrievable, more durable, and more flexible for later use. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do that is just to ask learners to write down or say everything they know about a topic. Another approach is to quiz or test learners, which is probably the best known use of retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is often referred to as test-enhanced learning, or the testing effect, right? So by testing and quizzing, we require students, trainees to bring information to mind, and that actually strengthens the memory. Another way to use retrieval practice, which I was unaware of, I knew this worked, is teaching, right? We all know, if you've been a teacher, you kind of know that being a teacher is probably the best way to learn a topic, right? If you really know a topic, you can teach it. And if you teach it, you really know that topic. Now, why is that? Well, they're starting to understand now that it's really about retrieval practice. When you teach without notes, what are you doing? You're constantly retrieving information from long-term memory and sharing it with your students. So it's that act of retrieving to be taught material that makes teaching such a powerful learning opportunity. All right, but here's one of the problems with retrieval practice. And actually, it's a problem with all of these strategies that we know work really well when it comes to learning. And that's the difference between our own intuition about what works and the reality of learning. Or stated another way, your predicted performance and your actual performance. So this data come from a classic study by Roediger and Karpik. What they did was they had one group simply reread to-be-learned material. So they said, hey, spend an hour, reread the material. To the other group, the treatment group, they said, we're going to use retrieval practice. We're going to quiz these students on the material for the same amount of time. And then once they were done with that, they asked the students, how well did you learn the material? And you can see that those that reread the material felt like they learned more. I reread the material, I feel pretty good about the information. However, in reality, when they tested them later, sure enough, the group in the retrieval practice treatment group actually learned more and performed better on the test. So this is a key point. Our own intuitions about what works when it comes to learning, and importantly, our learners' own intuitions, they're often incorrect and they can lead us to pick kind of the wrong strategies. So instead of quizzing myself, I might just reread the chapter. Well, that's probably not a great strategy. I might just highlight my notes, probably not a great strategy. And that's because, again, intuitions and what actually works, they don't always align. All right, so how can we use what we know about retrieval practice in the classroom? You could probably come up with a lot of things, or in the clinic, that you could possibly do. Here's 4 things that I came up with. You could use low or no stakes tests, right? We do that a lot. These are tests for learning as opposed to tests of learning. We can ask questions that requires learners to write everything they know. We can use things like a concept map, right? Write down everything you know about this concept. And finally, we can design activities that require our learners to teach one another, right? So peer teaching. Again, they're going to be retrieving that information from memory. Okay, so here's a question. Do our learners know about these strategies? Let's assume for a second that these 6, empirically evidence-informed strategies work. Do students know about them? So this study from 2019, this was a medical teacher. It was a survey study. They surveyed about 700 learners and about 200 faculty, asking them about how they learn and how they teach. So what did they find? Well, one question they asked students was, how do you study? Do you use spaced practice, so spacing out studying across time, or do you cram? Clearly, spacing is a better strategy. It's one of those evidence-informed strategies. And students say, in large part, 70% said, I space out my learning. So that's a good news story. Again, social desirability might be a factor here. They probably know that that's the right answer. They also asked them about what other strategies do you use regularly? And here's what they came up with. I don't know if you can see that in the back of the room, but the top thing listed was test yourself with questions or practice problems. Excellent. They're using retrieval practice and they're reporting that they're doing that. 73% of students said that they did that. And I highlighted in blue, it's a little bit hard to see, kind of if I was scoring these on, yeah, these are evidence-informed strategies and these are not so good. You can see that they're using a lot of things that we know work well, and that's good. They're also highlighting their notes, which isn't necessarily a great strategy. They're recopying their notes. Yeah, it may or may not be a great strategy depending on how it's done. And I'm going to come back to this study later in the talk, but I just wanted to point out this idea that just knowing about strategies, the strategies that work, let's assume they knew that, oh, there's these 6 strategies and they can improve learning. Just knowing that is not enough. I mean, I know a lot about what it means to be healthy, eating right, exercising, but I don't always do those things. And the same can be said for learning. High quality learning requires a lot more than just knowledge of the strategies. And that's because it's my second principle, which is that learning is goal directed. So we need to consider our learners' goals and the extent to which those goals align with our own goals as educators. So let's talk a little bit about goals. We saw in that medical teacher study that students reported using some good strategies and some not so good strategies. So you might ask yourself, why don't they always use the strategies that work? Well, one possibility is that they're unaware of the strategies and that they're counting on their own intuition. And we know that that can sometimes be wrong, but let's assume that they know the strategies. Why don't they always use them? And I think that's because they have different goals that's guiding what they're doing. And sometimes they have competing goals. So let me give you an example. One goal might be to perform well on step 1. I think all of our students have that goal. And so after a long day in the clinic, based on that goal, they might spend 2 hours using retrieval practice, quizzing themselves, right? Great strategy, works well. However, maybe they have a competing goal of not getting burned out and protecting their well-being. If that was their goal, then after a long day in the clinic, they might choose instead to highlight their notes and listen to a podcast. Now, is that the most effective way to learn? Probably not, but it's something that they can actually muster the energy to do. And it better aligns with their second competing goal. And we can think about a broad set of goals, competing goals that learners often have. So if a student's goal is to maintain their professional ethics, then they probably wouldn't share answers on a test with students who haven't taken the test yet, right? At the same time, they might also have a competing goal to be a loyal, helpful friend and classmate who helps their friends out. In that case, they might share the answers or the questions on the test. Another goal might be to be a highly competent clinician. They probably all have that goal. And so if that's their goal, they might ask a lot of questions on rounds because they really want to learn. On the other hand, they might have a goal of avoiding looking dumb. And if that's their goal, then they might avoid questions. And finally, maybe they have the goal of becoming chief resident. And because of that, they're going to spend hours and hours in the clinic so they can achieve that goal. They might have a competing goal of being a good spouse, a good parent, a good brother, a good sister. And based on that goal, they might leave as soon as they're able. So we understand that we have lots of competing goals. And if you're asking yourself, geez, why aren't they doing this the way I want them to? Well, maybe it's because they have a competing goal. Another thing to realize is that their goals often diverge from ours. So you might ask yourself, what if they're not playing our game the way we devised it? Let me explain what I mean about that. And I love this quote from an anonymous source. In theory, there's a difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. The fact of the matter is we create a lot of instructional activities and curricula that, in theory, should work, especially if learners share our goals and are playing our game. But in practice, we know things are more complex, in part because of this competing goals issue. So let's use PBL as an example. Lots of work been on PBL. In theory, problem-based learning should work well because we've got collaborative students who are curiosity-driven. They're going to struggle with the material. They're going to co-teach each other. They're going to learn a ton. But in practice, we also have learners who really just want to get the right answer, maybe from last year's class. They might want to focus on the acquisition of content with that age-old question, will this be on the test? And maybe they want to finish in 2 sessions instead of 3 so they have time to study on their own. So again, in practice, this great PBL session that we devised might not function the way we hoped it would. Another important point is this notion that students are problem solvers, learners are problem solvers. We count on them to be problem solvers. We give them problems and they solve the problems. That's a big part of what it means to be a clinician. But the fact is, they do this problem solving, not just for the formal problems that we give them, they do them for the problem, they try to solve the problem of the curriculum. And you probably don't think of the curriculum as a problem, but it has some challenges, right? Huge amount of information to be assimilated in a highly competitive environment with high stakes, low frequency challenges in a new culture with a new language, new rules, and a new identity to be developed. So yeah, it's a challenge, it's a problem. And so students are problem solvers. They're going to try to figure out what are the rules of this system, what's valued, what's not, what's going to be rewarded, what are my goals in this particular situation based on my competing goals, and how do I balance that goals with everything else I have going on. So with this in mind, when we're developing curricula instruction, we shouldn't just ask what will create the best learning opportunities when they're playing my game. We should also ask to what would our grand course or grand curriculum design reduce to if they're not playing our game, but they're playing a different game with different goals. And would they still learn the material if they're playing a different game? We might also ask, what would this instructional activity look like in the hands of an overextended student who's just trying to survive medical school, residency training, or PhD training? And is there a better design for this course or this curriculum for a learner in that situation? And then finally, we want to make explicit the implicit. So for example, if we have retrieval practice activities worked into our instructional format, quizzes or peer teaching, we don't want to hide the rationale behind that. We should share that with the students so they know what we're doing and how it's going to help them achieve their goals. All right, so we've got cognitive strategies that can help with learning. We've got the notion that learning is goal-oriented. How about this one? Learning medicine is an emotional roller coaster. So let's talk a bit about emotions. There was a time not too long ago when people that studied learning didn't care much about emotions. It was more of a cold cognition sort of a model. But now we know that emotions and cognition, they can't be disentangled. They're closely integrated. And if we want to promote optimal learning, we have to consider emotions. So if we consider medical education, it's clear that it's emotional, right? Think about the joy of being admitted to medical school, the pride of the white coat ceremony, the anxiety before the first cadaver lab, the shame and humiliation of making an error, and the sadness of witnessing a patient's suffering, right? So it's very emotional. Now, typically when we think about emotions, I always think about positive and negative. That's one dimension. But there's another dimension that's helpful, and that's the arousal level or the activation level of an emotion. So for example, an emotion like anxiety, clearly a negative emotion, but it's activating. I might have been anxious about this talk, but it moved me. I was activated to prepare. So negative emotion, but it activates me to do something. How about boredom? Clearly a negative emotion, but it's deactivating. When I'm bored, I'm not motivated to do a whole lot. On the other side of the coin, something like joy is a positive emotion, but it's activating. When I'm enjoying something, I move to do things to maintain that enjoyment. And then last but not least, you might not have thought of a deactivating positive emotion, but something like relief. I'm relieved that I passed the exam, but now I need to take a break. I'm not motivated to prepare for the next one. I'm too busy reveling in my relief. And so you can imagine mapping a whole series of positive and negative emotions onto this 2 by 2. So for today, I'm going to focus on 2 specific emotions, one in particular. I'm going to talk about shame and guilt. And both of these are negative emotions, but whereas guilt tends to be activating, it causes people to make a change. Shame, we're finding, is deactivating. It has some really negative effects on learning. All right, so with this little introduction to emotion, when we think about shame, we're really summarizing it with this statement: I am not blank enough. I am not good enough, smart enough, creative enough. You assess yourself to be flawed or deficient in some global way. There's something wrong with you as a person that isn't very easy to change and that isn't necessarily specific to the situation. It's something about your whole core. And in some recent work that I'm about to share with you, we looked at residents and some more recent work around medical students, and asked them about shame. And we're finding that it's sort of a sentinel emotional event, and it can really negatively impact learning. All right, so to understand shame, I got to explain the self-conscious theory of self-conscious emotions. This comes from psychology. Self-conscious emotions are things like shame, guilt, and pride. Now, they're different. They're cognitively complex in the sense that it's different than anxiety or happiness, because you have to engage in some sort of self-evaluation. So if I see a bear in the hallway, I get afraid and I run. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to evaluate myself as a person. But when you experience shame, you're turning inward to yourself and you're saying, okay, how do I feel about what happened and where I am? And this arises from 4 basic steps that I'm going to run you through. Okay, first, something happens, an event, a failure to meet an expectation. Something happens with a patient that doesn't go well. It causes you to redirect yourself, your attention inward. A good example, again, is a poor patient outcome or a test failure. Next, you have to evaluate 2 sets of self-representations. First, your current self-representation. How am I viewing myself right now in light of these events? And the second is kind of who you're hoping to be, your stable long-term self-representation. How would my ideal self have acted in this situation? Who's the person I'm trying to be? Now, the third step, and this is a critical one, focuses on the congruence between those 2 sets. So if what you've done causes you to see yourself as aligned with your ideal self, you're going to feel pride, right? You went in there, you acted the way you want to act, the way a skilled physician would act. Feeling pretty good about that. You're going to have a lot of pride. However, if you do something to make your current self feel further away from your ideal self, you're going to feel shame or guilt. And so this distance between who you are and who you want to be, that feels bad, and that results in shame or guilt. Now, the difference between shame or guilt has to do with what you attribute that failure to. If you attribute to something stable, something about you as a person, that's shame. And if it's something about the situation that's fixable, it's unstable, then that's going to be guilt. And then just to drive this home, this is kind of what people say to themselves when they feel these different emotions. People who feel shame say things like, I'm bad, I'm not good enough, smart enough, intelligent enough, therefore I need to fix myself. People who feel guilt say, well, this thing I did was bad. Maybe my effort wasn't on task, but I can fix it. It's not about me, it's about the situation, and I can improve. And so with guilt, the action tendency is it's activating, right? It's to fix the problem. You screw something up, I'm okay as a person, I just need to study more next time. I need to prepare for the procedure. That's guilt. That's a good thing. If you feel shame, the action tendency is a lot different. It's to curl up in a ball, disengage, withdraw, because the pain of viewing yourself as not good enough. And that can be really hard. So let me share some work. This is Will Bynum's work. Will's at Duke University. He just finished his PhD from Maastricht. He did a whole series of studies on shame. This was the first study that I was involved with. We interviewed 12 residents at a large teaching hospital, and we asked them about shame experiences. Now, we didn't just say, hey, tell us about a time when you felt shame, because shame is a loaded word and people have different definitions. What we said was we had them write about a time when they felt deficient, flawed, or unworthy. We had them write for 20 minutes, and then we did a 1-hour interview. We dug into what happened and how they felt about it. So I'm going to walk you through some of the results, just so you can sort of hear and see what shame looks like in residents. So they felt deficient, the worst, unlikable and inferior, undeserving and inadequate. Pretty classic shame talk. They also said they felt flawed, like there was something wrong with them, as well as not smart enough, the dumbest person here. And those last two, you really don't get more shame consistent than that kind of talk. We had another resident who said, I suck at everything. I'm a bad doctor. I'm not that smart. And then this resident went on to describe a downward emotional spiral. This next one comes from someone who made a mistake, and as a result, patient died. And so they felt like the training had failed, and they felt deficient and flawed. And this happened early in residency training. And lastly, this quote comes from a learner who was berated by an attending after making an error. And she said, I felt inferior. She made me feel like a bad doctor. So this is an example of shame in response to potential learner mistreatment. All right, so what triggers these shame events? We put them into 3 buckets. The first bucket are clinical events. These are some of the most common, right? Patient care event that doesn't go well, some adverse outcome. Next was learning events. These were very common and somewhat more worrisome. So these are trouble with tests, missing questions on a test, pretty normal parts of education. And we had residents who really felt ashamed by these failures. And then lastly, we had more personal failure to achieve goals, like personal goals, being rejected, failing at home. So all of these things could result in shame. And then what happens? What's the end result of feeling these shame? And this is a list of sort of long-term consequences that, again, these are consequences that the residents described, and they're pretty much all negative. And the ones with the little arrows, those are sort of things that could negatively impact learning, since that's what I'm talking about here today. Okay, so what do we do about it? What are the strategies? How can you use this as an instructor, as a faculty member? How can we promote resilience in these environments? I don't have time to go through all of these strategies. I'm just going to list 2. One is to just listen for shame. And that's why I shared these quotes. It helps to recognize what this sounds like, so then you can intervene if necessary. So it's pure recognition. The next one is to share the idea of sharing your own stories, so we can change the culture, this sort of culture of silence that we often have in medicine. And I saw something on Twitter the other day, I think it was at Emory. They had a session where seasoned physicians were standing up and talking about challenges that they've had and times when they've made mistakes. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. Imagine how powerful it would be if the department rock star stood up and said, hey, I made a mistake, I'm imperfect, this is what I'm going to do to fix it. That could be really powerful. And that's what Emory was doing in that session. Okay, so that's emotion. We've got cognition, we've got goals, we've got emotion. I've got another poll. What is your preferred learning style? I'm going to shift gear and talk a little about learning styles. Raise your hand if you would consider yourself a visual learner. Okay, most of the people in the room. How about a auditory learner? Okay, we've got 3 auditory learners. How about a kinesthetic learner? Okay. Okay, yeah, some people are crossing borders, that's good. And who doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about? Okay, good. So you've all heard of learning styles. That's great. I hope I don't burst anyone's bubble. It's pretty clear that students, learners have important differences, but the question is, what are those differences that matter? I've just discussed several of them: learning strategies, goals, emotional differences. These things can matter, and they can matter a lot. But as I'm about to explain, learning styles are not an important difference. That's going to be my claim today, and hopefully I'll make that point. Learning styles are not an important thing when it comes to learning. Now, I think most of you are familiar with learning styles theory. I went on Google and just Googled learning styles, and it came up with a bunch of these different models. There's been a ton of models over the last 70 years, 50 years. There's been like 71 different learning styles models. And there's a whole industry that's grown up around this idea of a learning style. And most of the industry is selling measurement tools, surveys, to assess your learners and figure out where they are, and then do something about it. So that brings us to, so you categorize your learners, and then you use what's known as the learning styles matching or meshing hypothesis. That says that individuals have different learning styles, and so teachers can improve learning by matching or meshing their teaching methods to their students' learning styles. So for example, if somebody's a visual learner, then we should teach using methods that use pictures. On the other hand, if they're a kinesthetic learner, then we should use teaching methods that use movement or some sort of physical activity. And if we do this, the idea is that we're presenting content in the modality that they prefer, and we're going to improve learning. So it's really meant to be a tailored approach, and it makes a ton of intuitive sense. Unfortunately, most of what's contained in the learning styles literature has been largely debunked. That is, there's basically no good evidence to support the idea that matching your teaching style to your students' learning styles has much of any positive effect on learning. And this paper is a review article from 2009. They reviewed 60 years of empirical literature, and what they found was that, and I quote, "There's no adequate evidence to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general educational practice." So what do we know about learning styles? Do learners have individual differences or preferences in learning? I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, to the extent that you ask people, what's your preferred style? They will raise their hand just like we all did. So yes, I might have a preferred way of learning. That's not the important question. The important question is if I match my teaching style to that learning style, does that matter? And the existing evidence suggests that it doesn't matter. Is there a better way to think about this matching hypothesis? The answer is yes, and I'm going to explain that here in a minute. But before I do that, let me come back to this paper. This is that 2019 paper, Medical Teacher. They asked people about their learning approaches. They also asked them their study habits. They also asked them about learning styles. They said, do you believe you or your students have a specific learning style, e.g. visual, verbal? And 91% of faculty said yes, and 53% of students said yes. Okay, that's fine. I don't see that as a problem. We think that people have preferences. Yes, we all have preferences. The important question is, what do you do about it? So this question was to teachers, do you accommodate the learning styles differences of your learners? And 79% of faculty said, yes, I try to accommodate those learning styles. And yet we just saw that 60 years of evidence tells us that this isn't effective. All right, so what's the more effective approach? What's my claim that what's the more effective approach? The better approach is to match your teaching strategies, methods, to the characteristics of what you're teaching. Here's a simple example. Let's say I wanted to help students learn the shapes of the US states for some unknown reason. Well, I'm probably going to want to use images or pictures of the states to help them learn shapes, as opposed to just describing the shape in words, obviously. Now, this instructional technique works for everyone, not just students who say they're visual learners. This works for everyone because it's aligned with the thing you're trying to do, which is to teach somebody about shapes. This one's a little closer to home. Let's say I want to teach somebody a surgical procedure. Well, yeah, I'm probably going to want to use methods that use some type of hands-on practice, doing the skills required to be a surgeon. So again, it's not about matching the method to the preferred style, like using a hands-on approach for a kinesthetic learner. It's about matching the teaching method to the thing you're trying to teach, in this case, surgical skills. And here's one more approach that's better than that matching learning styles to teaching method, and that's using something called dual coding. So dual coding is one of those 6 cognitive strategies that I mentioned early on. This is the idea that when you combine auditory and visual information, learning is enhanced, and that's because humans process auditory and visual information through 2 different cognitive channels. So when a teacher presents the same information in 2 formats, words and pictures, it gives learners 2 ways of remembering the information, thereby improving memory and recall. Now, because dual coding involves presenting things auditory and visual, it starts to sound like learning styles, but it's not. Learning styles said visual would be better for visuals and auditory for auditory. This says both auditory and visual works better for everyone. And so that's a big difference. So combining pictures and words can help all learners, not those who describe themselves as a certain type of learner. Okay, so hopefully I blew somebody's mind there, because oftentimes we still see a lot of learning style stuff out there. There's still a big industry, and hopefully my claims have been supported, but we can have that discussion. So let's say you heed the 4 things that I said. You know, you help students with those learning strategies, you deal with their goals, and you help them to sort of balance their goals. You are aware of shame and help students be resilient. And then you maybe disregard learning styles and you match your teaching style to the content. Are you going to get the gold medal of teaching? What do you think? Yeah, raise your hand. After you do all those things, are you going to get the gold medal? Raise your hand. No one's raising their hand. This is unfortunate. Yeah, you're probably not going to get the gold medal. Why is that? Well, that's because of Principle 5. Student evaluations of teaching are largely unrelated to learning. And therefore, high quality learning and high quality instruction that led to that high quality learning does not always translate into good teaching evaluations. We know this, so let's dig in a little bit. I had on my notes, this might surprise you, but clearly it doesn't, because none of you raised your hand. But we evaluate everything we do in higher ed, in medical education, with surveys. So the assumption is that there's some validity to these surveys, right? What does the literature say? Well, the most recent work calls into question this validity assumption. This is from Uttle and colleagues. They looked at 51 studies. They did a meta-analysis, and they found that rating student evaluations of teaching at most explained about 1% of the variance in learning outcomes. And the authors conclude, and I quote, "These findings suggest that institutions focused on student learning and career success may want to abandon student evaluations of teaching as a measure of faculty's teaching effectiveness." The other thing we should note is that student evaluations of teaching are also, there's quite a bit of research out there that suggests that they're biased against women, they're biased against people of color, short people, even less beautiful people. And so that's a problem as well. Here's another one. I wish I had come up with this study. Some of you are familiar. This is a genius randomized controlled trial where what the researchers found was if they provided cookies after a residency session, guess what? They saw statistically significant and very large increases in residents' ratings of teachers, course materials, and overall course. So what's the take-home message? I think it's clear. Student evaluations of teaching are of limited value, especially when trying to determine if our teaching is actually improving learning. Now, that being said, there will be cookies after the session. So keep that in mind as you fill out your post-course evaluations. All right, one final thing, and I'll finish up. This study is relevant to the issue, of course, student evaluations of teaching. Let's see if I can summarize. So what they did, this was in the National Academy, Proceedings of the National Academy. They wanted to know, how do students' perceptions of their own learning relate to their actual learning? So it's very similar to that early study, that Carpick study. So they were comparing a passive classroom where students watched a lecture and an active classroom where they did peer teaching and all kinds of activities. So what do they find? Well, as you might expect, those in the active learning group where they were asked to solve problems in small groups, collaborate, they performed better on the test. They learned more than the students in the passive group who just watched lectures. However, when the students were asked to evaluate the method, instructional method, they did this before they took the test. As you might not surprise you, those in the passive group said they felt like they learned more. So those that went to lecture said, I feel like I'm learning more. Those in the active classroom said, I feel like I'm learning less. And then the performance was switched. So this comes back to this whole idea of not trusting our own intuitions, right, about what works when it comes to learning. Very similar to that Carpick study. The takeaway here is that students' feelings of learning don't always align with their actual learning. And that's because high quality learning, like that which likely occurred in this active classroom, is hard, right? It takes a lot of cognitive effort. And so students take that effort to signify poor learning and therefore rate the instruction as worse, when in reality, it was better instruction. Another reason why we can't really trust student evaluations of teaching. So what do we do about this? Well, I think it's safe to say that we have to take student evaluations of teaching with a big grain of salt, unlikely to be related to the actual quality of instruction. But we're probably not going to get rid of student evaluations of teaching, right? We're just not going to. We need it for accreditation. We need it for other program evaluation. There are only certain ways to get at some questions that we have, and we have to ask those on a survey. But we need to be careful about what we ask students to do, right? What we ask them to evaluate so that we can interpret those results. We don't really want to ask students, how much did you learn? Were you satisfied with the instruction? Those types of questions don't really give us much because they're unrelated to actual learning. And we shouldn't put too much stock in any one student evaluation, right? We want to look at trends over time. I think that's pretty obvious. So the bottom line here is we have to use student evaluations of teaching with caution and supplement with things like peer reviews of teaching and actual, objective outcomes. We need to tell the LCME that too. Okay, so in closing, there's a lot of things I could have talked about today. A lot of different principles. We could have talked about motivation. That's one of my favorites. This notion that assessments drive behavior and performance. The idea that learning is situated in social interactions. It improves when we manage cognitive load. We could talk about feedback. There's lots of other important learning principles. I talked about these 5 because I think they can have a large effect if we can figure out a way to translate these into our own practice in improving learning outcomes. But again, as I mentioned, I'm not, obviously, the link between psychology and teaching is not direct, but I think with your inventive minds, we can make that translation. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes.
I have a question. So you talked about shame, right? And the research that you've done on shame and how, that's prevalent in learners as well as all of us. Can you talk a little bit about kind of shame and imposter phenomenon, like where you see that those concepts kind of overlap or different from one another?
Yeah, I think if we think about this notion of who you want to be and who you currently are, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think Will has written a bit about the overlap. But yeah, I mean, if who you're trying to be, if you're not who you're trying to be, where you currently are is not that future person, then yeah, you're going to feel like an imposter in all kinds of settings. So I think they're closely aligned. I don't know if anyone's ever, I'd like to measure the two and see how closely correlated, but I think there's going to be a lot of overlap. And I think the average person is maybe not going to differentiate between, because again, if you believe that theory of sort of, it's really about my self-assessment of where I am now and where I want to be, the farther that distance, the more of an imposter you're going to feel in those settings. So I think if we can address imposter syndrome, we're going to be addressing shame and vice versa, because they're closely linked. Yeah, and Will has explored this so we did residents, that was the first study. He's looked at medical students at Duke, he's looked at pre-med students, and now the next phase is to sort of let's go into practice and see what shame looks like out there with practicing physicians. And he makes the claim that, some of the well-being work, that the great work that you've done, we have to look beyond just burnout. There could be other emotional issues going on there. It's not just about being burned out. And he makes some strong arguments about the impacts and negative impacts of shame. Yeah, but we need more work. I mean, there's not much. He's really only done the only work, and it's mostly qualitative. We're developing a questionnaire now, a shame questionnaire that we can use to see how shame changes across contexts, across different clinical specialties, across settings. So that'll be interesting to examine that. And then we can measure imposter syndrome. I think there's some tools out there for doing that.
Got a question in the chat. Often we are meeting a medical student or resident for the first time in the clinic or wards and perform time-limited bedside clinical teaching. How do you apply principles 1 to 3 in this time, or 1 through 3 in this time-limited bedside teaching? For instance, for cognitive strategies like retrieval practice, the learner's goals, the learner's emotions, are you asking them before the teaching and learning interaction? Should we be doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that time limitedness is a huge problem. Not a huge problem, a huge challenge. But yeah, and I think you can use something like questioning. Obviously, pimping is not the way to go, but questioning is retrieval practice. So if you can figure out a way to do that in a constructive way, it's going to be useful. But if you're pimping students and embarrassing them and humiliating them and shaming them, then it's going to have the opposite effect. As far as goals, yeah, I think asking students, what are your goals in this setting, can be helpful. They're probably going to look at you like you're from Mars. What do you mean? What are my goals? But digging in a little bit, and then you can say, all right, if that's your goal, then you might want to go in this direction. But yeah, the time limitedness is really hard. I'm a theoretician, and that's why it's kind of a cop-out where I said, I'm going to trust you to translate, because a lot of these things, there is no direct translation. You have to, that's the art of teaching. It's like, all right, that's great, but I have 5 minutes. The bedside, how do I do that? That's the challenge.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm really interested in what you were saying about the competing. Really interested in what you were saying about the competing commitments between the faculty and the learners. What I've seen written on that is that the faculty often don't know what the learners' competing commitments are, and the learners often don't know what the learners' competing commitments are.
Yeah.
And that could lead to some struggling learners. Do you have any advice on how to dig in
How to
and
get
find
at
out
that?
what those are?
That's a good question. I've not seen that in literature. Those ideas around competing goals and the fact that their goals might not align with ours, that comes from Glenn Regere's work. He hasn't written about it. He gave a talk, and I referenced him on the slides. But yeah, I think you have to ask. I don't think we do that enough. Now, it's hard. Again, if you're in year 1 and you're in a big lecture hall, how are you going to ask your students what their goals are? Probably easier to do in the bedside environment. And then I think it's worth questioning ourselves, what is our goal for this particular activity that I'm doing? Do I have a goal? I mean, I have a general goal, helping them learn the material, but more specifically, what am I trying to do here? And this idea of being explicit about the things you're doing in a class or in a class, I hate when people hide what they're doing. Like, don't hide what you're doing. Students are smart. If you tell them we're doing it for these reasons, and we know from the literature that this is going to work, they might be more likely to take that on board. But these goals, they're shifting minute to minute. It's not like I have this goal. They probably have an overarching goal that guides everything they do, but minute to minute, they have, competing. And I made this comment on Twitter about competing goals, and Eric Holmbo said, well, maybe they're not competing, maybe they're complementary goals. I said, well, maybe you can help them figure out, okay, you have these two goals, they seem like they're competing. How can we complement those two goals and then mesh it with what I'm trying to do? I think it's a conversation, hard to do in a lecture, easier to do one-on-one. But I've not seen anyone do it in practice and write about it, so I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sir. Juan.
Hello.
Yeah.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Artino. I'm curious about learning principles and practices for people when we're quote unquote out of training. What we do versus what learners see us do, and then how what we do or don't do kind of impacts how we think other people should be studying, should be learning, et cetera. Because I think a lot of the things we're sharing becomes very different when you're in practice, or doesn't, but we don't have the same pressures involved. So the question is, how does this apply to folks who are done with quote unquote training, and how does that impact our involvement with learning?
That's a great question. I mean, those strategies, they can work in any context, right? They're sort of context independent. I was going to go back to my slides, but I won't bother. So I think being explicit, sort of modeling, well, especially if you're teaching and you're trying to model sort of what you want them to do, that can be one way. But I think you're talking about when you're on your own and there's no learners involved and you're doing your maintenance and certification, you can use those strategies just as well there, testing effect, interleaving, mixing in different topics, spaced practice, obviously. But again, you could be explicit. I think being explicit about what you're doing and why you're doing it and modeling that is super helpful to learners, because they think, oh, once I'm a doctor, then I'm good. Well, no, it's a continuous challenge, use it or lose it. So I've got to study in this way, and this is how I'm going to do it. I'm doing it based on this strategy, which I know works. Yes.
Really looking at conditions who've been taught in this model and just seeing if they are in fact better and more knowledgeable clinicians.
I don't. When you say this model, what do you mean?
So, fire those information.
Yeah.
Versus more collaborative, thinking about our emotions kind of approach. And I mean, I absolutely believe that this is a much better way of doing it.
But where's the evidence? Yeah.
But yeah, how far, I don't think we're there yet, but how far are we from going back?
I don't know if we're ever going to know that for a fact, because there's so many intervening factors. And so we've made, and there's so many overlapping variables, right? So it's like, well, we went to pass fail, but we also do this, but we also do active learning. So which thing influenced what? I think from a research perspective, it's almost impossible to know what caused what. And I've not seen any studies that have tried to do that really writ large on a large scale. Now, if you've got some longitudinal data, which sounds like you may have here, you could maybe get at some of those. But yeah, it's a tough research question, because again, we always want to know, do the educational effects, that treatments, do they matter? And it's such a complex question, because there was 10 other things that happened too. And how do you take those into account?
I was just going to add that the first question that comes to my mind is, does it matter for what? How do we measure that idea of being a good doctor?
Yeah, what's good doctor? First, you got to define that.
What is that outcome that we care about, to look at which of these learning strategies fit that outcome? You can tell me that, we do have a lot of the data that we could look into.
Yeah, yeah, so what is that? What is that good doctor? What is that person? And what a good doctor is probably looks different today than it did 20 years ago. So that makes it even more challenging to answer the question, does it matter what we're doing? Is it better? Better than what? And for what purpose?
Juan's question made me think about the fact that we probably behind the doors that our students don't see, harness some of the activating features that you talked about. So if I feel guilty about missing a diagnosis or a treatment, I've shared that with my team before, then I'm motivated to read more about it, learn more about it, and not make the mistake the next time for my patient. And the same thing, if I feel excited or joyful about the new emerging, I'm an infectious disease doctor, a new emerging pathogen, and it makes me happy to learn about it, then I'm probably going to read more and learn about that. So my question is really related to how do you leverage those activating features? We talked about avoiding the shame part.
Yeah.
Right? With our learners, nobody wants to shame our learners, but how do we activate in the classroom to help with the learning stickiness? I think that would be something that maybe could be an intervention that we could do.
Well, I think part of it is sharing what you just said, like sharing that with your trainees. Hey, listen, I had this happen to me. I felt awful. I actually felt ashamed because I felt like it was about me as a person. But I reassessed and I would realize that it was just this thing that I hadn't been prepared to do. So I went back, I studied harder, and then next time it was a better outcome. So I think sharing those, I don't think we do that enough. It's sort of like, I'm the acting physician and I'm not going to tell them all the things in the closet. But if you can share that, then they're like, oh, this person's a human. That's cool. And that's the thing they were doing to Emory. It was like, stand up, tell us about that time when you were by yourself and you made an error and then what you did about it. Yeah, I think we need to share more, not be, you gotta be vulnerable to do that, right? To admit that I made this mistake. And then when you're talking to students and they make a mistake, focus on the behavior. It's not about you as a person. You can do this. This is the mistake that you made. You can fix that. It's unstable. That's good. It's fixable. Again, it's not about your whole core. It's about this behavior, the specific situation. I think redirecting them in that way can be helpful. Yes, sir.
The activation issue is sort of interesting, because to the extent you push that, I think it would lead to unity and knowledge and understanding, because I'm pumped about some new germ. Is that the technical term, germ? No, but I never liked endocrinology. And so it just never did. So this goes up, that goes down, I don't care. But from a learning point of view, and this have people go to the grand rounds about the thing they already know about.
Yes.
And they don't go to the grand rounds about the thing that's a gap in their knowledge.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges I studied self-regulated learning for a long time, self-directed learning. And that's one of the critiques. It's like, well, wait a minute. When you go to a conference, what sessions do you go? Do you go to the sessions where I really need some remediation on this? No, you go to the sessions, the stuff that you already know and think is cool. And so that's a problem, because and the unskilled and the unaware that should be going to the session don't know that they're unskilled and unaware. And so it's really difficult. We don't often go to the things that are going to help us. Are we being Zoom bombed?
Yeah, somebody's mute keeps turning on and off, so I muted that. But we have a few more questions in the chat. Student feedback surveys will not go away anytime soon. What type of questions do you suggest we use in surveys? Do you think very explicit, clear questions will work?
Well, I'm going to talk about surveys here in a little bit. I think what to avoid are the things around, did you learn? Are you satisfied? I think those are the least useful. I mean, yeah, we have to ask students if they've been mistreated. Like, who else is going to know that? I think that's fair game. We have to ask them about the structure of the course and whether they think that worked or not. Again, whether it did and whether it positively impacted learning, we don't know. And we have to write good quality items, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. So yeah, I agree. They're not going away as much as I'd like them to. I'm the survey person who always tries to convince people not to do a survey because odds are it's not going to be very good. and you're not gonna get what you need from it. So, but we have accrediting agencies that put a lot of stock in surveys. So we're kind of chasing our tail there. So again, I don't know exactly what to put on there, but I know what not to put on there. And that's questions of, did you learn? Was this instructor, effective? Because I don't know that they know that intuition is not there for. We've all had like the hardest thing we've ever done that we don't ever want to do again, but it was fantastic learning, right? And maybe at the time we would have rated that poorly because it was so painful. But man, I learned a lot. So. And we'll talk about how to write good items here in a little bit, if you can make it to that.
That's everything in the chat. Do we have more questions?
Juan, you get one more question. That's it.
What I find most activating is things that are tied to patients. I can still remember lessons I learned, whether mistakes or otherwise, from my first year of medical school, connected to a specific person. And I'm just wondering, thoughts, suggestions on how to leverage that beyond it just naturally happening.
Again, if I'm you and I'm a faculty, I'm sharing that very point, redirecting that everything we're doing is really about the patient. And so that's a motivator for me. I'm looking to activate in a positive or a negative way. And, a negative emotion is not a bad emotion, right? It's not like we should avoid those things. We should redirect when things are shame inducing, because that tends to cause people to curl up in a ball and say, yeah, that didn't go well. That wasn't great. It's not about you. Redirect it. It's about the patient, and you can fix this by doing these three things. So again, focusing on the behavior, not you're a terrible trainee or whatever it is. Not that we would say that, but that sometimes comes across when it goes unsaid.
All right, thank you very much. Just a plug for the rest of the afternoon, here at 1:30, we're gonna have a really great session on building your national reputation. There's gonna be a panel, and then we're gonna have tabletop conversations. We will be providing cookies at 3.
Do the survey right
On
now.
an unrelated note, there are session evaluation QR codes.
Unrelated.
And so we will put 4 o'clock survey workshop this afternoon in this room. And if you check the website for the academy, you'll see events for tomorrow starts at 9 a.m. with a couple of different great workshops. We're going to have a panel discussion about more pragmatic strategies to support your learner. And there's going to be more posters, oral presentations, and then a couple of workshops in the afternoon. So look for those details, and hope to see many of you again this afternoon and tomorrow. Thanks again for coming. And thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Got some nice comments in there. You want to look at the chat?
Yeah.
So